Last time we sat down together, I told you something didn't add up. We looked at why your paycheck feels thinner, why the grocery aisle feels meaner, why your savings keep disappearing into bills you didn't used to have. And at the end of that conversation, I said something I want to come back to today. I said there's another layer on top of all this, a policy layer. One that doesn't show up on any receipt, doesn't show up on any bill, and yet you've been paying it all year long. Now here's the number I want you to sit with for a second. According to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, their research desk, February of this year, nearly 90% of the cost of America's tariffs has fallen on American families and American businesses. Not on China, not on Europe, not on Mexico, on you, on me, on the household down the street. And depending on whose math you trust, Tax Foundation, the Peterson Institute, Yale's Budget Lab, the average American household paid somewhere between $1,000 and $1,750 more this year because of tariffs alone, $1,000 to $1,700. And most folks I talk to have no idea they paid it. So by the end of this video, you're going to know exactly where that money went. You're going to understand who actually writes the check when Washington puts a tariff on a foreign country. Spoiler, it isn't the foreign country. You're going to see, with real data, why the washing machine in your laundry room costs more than it should, why the truck in your driveway costs more than it should, and why the roof over your head got more expensive to repair this year. And maybe most importantly, you're going to know what to watch next, because this story isn't over. Let's get into it. So let's start with the question nobody in Washington likes to answer straight. When the government puts a tariff on a foreign country, who actually pays it? The official line, the one you hear on cable news, goes something like this: we're putting tariffs on China. China is going to pay. It sounds clean. It sounds like justice. It's also not how tariffs work. Let me show you why. I want you to picture something with me. Imagine a toll booth, a long bridge, and every imported good in America, every toaster, every t-shirt, every 2x4 of Canadian lumber has to cross that bridge to get into the country. Washington puts up a sign at the booth that says, "Foreign trucking company pays the toll." But here's what actually happens. That foreign trucker doesn't just eat the cost. He's running a business, so he adds the toll to his bill. The American importer, the company bringing the goods in, pays the toll right there at the border. Then the importer sells to the warehouse. The warehouse sells to the store. The store sells to you. And every step of that chain, the toll gets baked a little deeper into the price tag. By the time that toaster lands on your kitchen counter, the foreign company has not written one single check to Washington. You did, at the checkout line. And here's the part most folks miss. The American-made toaster sitting on the next shelf over, it goes up too. Because the moment your competitor's price jumps 15%, you don't have to stay cheap anymore. You raise yours to match. That's not greed, that's just how markets breathe. Now, I know what you're thinking. All right, that's a nice story. Where's the proof? Fair question. Because the truth is, for years, economists actually debated this. How much of a tariff really gets passed to the consumer? Maybe foreign companies eat half of it, maybe a quarter, maybe more. Well, we don't have to guess anymore. In February of this year, the research desk at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, not a think tank, not a partisan group, Fed, published their numbers. In the first 8 months of 2025, 94% of the tariff cost was paid by Americans. 94. A 10% tariff caused foreign export prices to drop only 0.6%. Point. The rest? It came right through the border and into the price you paid. And a separate study out of the Kiel Institute in Germany. That's one of Europe's most respected economics research centers. Put the number at 96%. Their lead researcher said it bluntly. The claim that foreign countries pay these tariffs is a myth. Two of the most rigorous research institutions in the world, working with different data, looking at different time windows, arrived at the same answer. 9 out of every $10 in tariff cost paid by Americans. Now I want to step back and give you a sense of scale, because the rate of these tariffs has moved fast. At the start of 2025, The average effective tariff rate on goods coming into the United States was about 2.5%. 2.5. By the end of the year, it was 13%. To put that in perspective, you have to go back to the 1940s, before most of us were born, to find a tariff rate that high. On Chinese goods specifically, the rate went from about 3% before 2018 to somewhere between 31 and 35% today. More than a tenfold increase. So when we talk about why your grocery bill, your car payment, your home repair quote all seem to have gotten heavier this year, this is the layer underneath. Not the only reason, but a real one, a measurable one, and one that, until today, you probably hadn't been told about straight. Now, before I take you into the single best example of how this plays out in real life, one I think you're going to remember every time you do laundry. I owe you a small footnote. Now, you know I always do this, and I'm going to keep doing it. What I share on this channel is education. It's perspective. It's 30 years of watching numbers move, explained in plain English. It's not financial advice. Your mortgage, your retirement timeline, your zip code, none of that's on my desk. I spent 3 decades giving people advice they didn't take, and they did just fine anyway. So if you're making a real decision about your money, sit down with a professional who knows. Your numbers, not mine. One more housekeeping note, tariff policy in 2025 and 2026 has changed almost every month. Supreme Court rulings, new sections of law kicking in, deals signed, deals broken. Every number I just gave you is accurate as of the date it was published. But the direction, who pays, how much, why, that part hasn't changed in 200 years of trade policy. Clears throat. All right. With that on the table, let me tell you a story about a washing machine. All right. I want to tell you a story. And I'm telling you this one because it might be the single clearest example we have in modern American economics of what a tariff actually does to a household budget. The year is 2018. The Trump administration, the first one, puts a tariff on imported washing machines. The goal is simple, and on paper it sounds reasonable. Protect American appliance manufacturers. Bring jobs home. Make Whirlpool and GE and Maytag more competitive against Korean and Chinese imports. That's the pitch. Now, what happened next got studied so thoroughly that it ended up in the American Economic Review, which, for those of you who don't spend your evenings reading econ journals, is about as serious as it gets in my old line of work. Peer-reviewed, replicated, not somebody's opinion piece. Cold, hard data. Here's what they found. After the tariff went into effect, the price of a washing machine in America went up about 12%, roughly $86 more per machine. Every washing machine, every store across the country. And that wasn't just the imported brands. Whirlpool, an American company, the one this tariff was supposedly designed to protect, raised its prices too. So did GE, so did Maytag. Why? Because once your competitor's price jumps $86, you don't need to keep yours low anymore. You raise yours to match, you pocket the difference, and the consumer pays for both. But that's not even the strange part of the story. Here's the strange part. The researchers also looked at dryers. Now there was no tariff on dryers, not 1 cent. Dryers were completely untouched by this policy. They were sitting right there on the showroom floor, free and clear. And yet, dryer prices went up by almost exactly the same amount as washing machines, $86, on a product that had no tariff on it. How does that happen? Well, if you've ever shopped for a washing machine, you already know the answer. You don't buy one, you buy the pair. The retailer prices them together, sells them together, delivers them together. So when the cost of the washer goes up, the store quietly raises the dryer to match. And you, standing in the aisle at Lowe's or Home Depot, paying for both machines, never even know a tariff was involved. One tariff, 2 products got more expensive. That's not a loophole. That's not a mistake. That's just how the real economy works when you start pulling on one thread. Now let me give you the number that I think really tells the story. The whole point of the tariff, remember, was to create American jobs. And it did create some. Economists estimate about 1,800 new jobs in the protected appliance industry. That's real. That's not nothing. 1,800 American families with a paycheck because of this policy. worth acknowledging. But the consumer cost of that tariff, the extra money you and I and every other American household paid in higher appliance prices, came out to about $1.5 billion. You do the math, $1.5 billion divided by 1,800 jobs. The Tax Foundation ran that calculation. The cost to consumers per job created was $815,000. Now, I want you to sit with that for a second. It would have been cheaper, much cheaper, to walk up to 1,800 Americans, hand each of them a check for $500,000, and just ask them politely to go work at an appliance factory. We didn't do that. Of course we didn't do that. Instead, we built a system where every American household paid a little bit extra at Best Buy, at Costco, at the local appliance store, to fund jobs that cost more to create than the workers themselves earned. No economist of any political stripe defends those numbers. Not conservative ones, not liberal ones. They're just bad math. But, and this is the part where I want to be honest with you, the harder question isn't whether the math is bad. The harder question is, how does a policy like that get made in the first place? Who decides $815,000 a job is a fair trade? I remember when I first saw those washing machine numbers come across my desk. This was a couple years after the tariff went into effect. The AER paper had just come out, and one of the younger analysts at our shop printed it out and dropped it on my desk. I read the numbers. I read them again, and I called the kid back in. I said, "Are you sure this is right? $815,000 per job. That can't be right." He pulled out his calculator and walked me through it. It was right. And I'll tell you what I told him then, because I think it's the lesson that matters here. I said the numbers aren't the surprise. The surprise is that we keep being surprised, because this story, tariff, goes on. Prices go up more than expected, side effects we didn't plan for, cost per job numbers that don't make any sense. This isn't a 2018 story. This is a 1930s story. It's a 2002 story. It's a 2025 story. We've run this experiment over and over again in this country for 100 years, and every time we act like the result is new. Now, I don't tell you this to make you cynical. I tell you this so that next time someone on TV tells you a tariff is going to bring jobs back, without costing you anything, you know to ask one more question. You know to ask, how much per job? Because the answer matters. It matters a lot. All right, the washing machine is one story, one product, one tariff, one moment in time. But the 2025 wave of tariffs hits almost everything you buy. So let's open up your shopping cart and walk through it, aisle by aisle. So let's open up the shopping cart. 3 categories, 3 very different stories, but the same thread running through all of them, clears throat. Let's start with the one that probably hits hardest. Cars. Kelley Blue Book tracks new vehicle prices every single month. In September of 2025, the average transaction price for a new car in America crossed $50,000 for the first time in history. It stayed above $50,000 for 8 straight months. Now, I want to be careful here, because this is where a lot of headlines get it wrong. If you've been watching car prices climb since 2019, most of that increase is not tariffs. The pandemic gutted semiconductor supply. Automakers pivoted to trucks and SUVs. General inflation pushed costs up across the board. Those factors were already in the price before 2025. The isolatable tariff effect, the piece that belongs specifically to the 2025-25. Percent auto tariff is about 10% of sticker price. On an imported vehicle, that's somewhere between $5,000 and $9,000. On an American-made vehicle, steel and aluminum input costs add another $1,500 to $2,000. Real money, just not the whole story. And remember what we talked about last time, that sharp drop in auto spending in the BEA data, $9 billion in a single quarter. That's not people falling out of love with cars. That's people standing in the showroom, looking at that sticker, and deciding to wait. That wait-and-see behavior has a cost too. We'll come back to that. Clears throat. Next, clothing and footwear. Yale Budget Lab ran the numbers on apparel and footwear, 2 categories that lean heavily on imports from China and Southeast Asia. Short-term price increases. Leather goods and shoes, 39 to 40%. Clothing, 37 to 38%. Think about what that means at the register. A $50 pair of sneakers that would have cost $50 last year is closer to $70 today. A $100 jacket is pushing $140. And unlike a car, you don't have the option to wait another year on shoes. But the category I want to close on is the one that catches most people off guard: home repair and construction. The National Association of Home Builders surveyed their members this year. Average cost increase per new home due to tariffs alone, $10,900. That's before the contractor adds his markup. Most of that comes from two places: steel and aluminum, now carrying a 50% tariff, and Canadian lumber. Now, you might not think of lumber as an import story, but about a third of the lumber America uses comes from across the northern border. Canada supplies roughly 85% of our softwood lumber imports, and that lumber now carries a combined tariff rate of around 45%. I'll be fair, there's a genuine debate about how much of that lands on the final home price. The lumber industry and the home builders don't agree on the math, but both sides agree the direction is up. And if you've gotten a quote for a deck, a roof repair, or a kitchen renovation recently, you already know that in your gut. 3 categories: cars, clothes, construction. In each one, the tariff effect is real, it's measurable, and it lands hardest on the people who can least afford to absorb it. Which brings me to something I think deserves its own moment: how tariff inflation is different from the kind of inflation we talked about in the last 2 videos, because they don't behave the same way, not even close. All right, before we go any further, I want to draw a distinction that I think matters more than most people realize. Because there are 2 kinds of price pressure hitting American households right now, and they are not the same animal. The first kind is energy inflation: oil prices, gas prices, heating bills. We looked at some of this in the last 2 videos: the Iran situation, Hormuz, the ripple effects through supply chains. Energy inflation is painful, but it has one important characteristic: it can reverse. If geopolitical tensions ease, if production increases, if demand softens, the price comes back down. It's volatile. It moves in both directions. Tariff inflation is different. When a tariff goes into effect, prices don't just spike and come back. They step up to a new level, and they stay there. Even if the tariff is eventually removed, the supply chains that reorganized around it, the contracts that got repriced, the supplier relationships that shifted, those don't snap back overnight. The price resets, and the reset is permanent. In economics, we call this a level shock versus a rate shock. Energy is a rate shock. It moves the needle. The needle can move back. Tariffs are a level shock. They move the floor, and the floor stays where it lands. Now, the people at the Federal Reserve have been wrestling with exactly this question. And I want to give you both sides of that debate because they're both worth hearing. Chair Powell, speaking in September of last year, described the tariff effect as relatively short-lived, a one-time shift in the price level. In other words, it hurts once, then it's done. The economy adjusts, inflation settles, we move on. That's the more optimistic read. But the president of the Chicago Fed, Austin Goolsbee, used different language. He called a tariff a negative supply shock, stagflationary. And stagflationary is a word that should get your attention, because it means the tariff makes both of the Fed's problems worse at the same time. Prices go up, growth slows down, and the Fed, which normally fights inflation by raising rates, or fights slowdowns by cutting them, suddenly has no clean move. So who's right? Honestly, probably somewhere in between. But here's the Goldman Sachs number that I think cuts through the noise. Their analysts estimated that tariffs added about 0.44 of a percentage point to core inflation in 2025. By March of this year, as more of those costs worked their way through supply chains, that contribution had risen to around 0.8 of a point. Now, core PCE, that's the Fed's preferred inflation measure, was running around 3% at the end of last year. Goldman's math says, pull the tariff effect out, and you're looking at something closer to 2%, right at the Fed's target, right where we'd all like to be, which tells you something important. The tariff layer isn't just an inconvenience at the checkout line. It's the difference between an economy that's roughly on track and one that keeps running hot enough to keep the Fed's finger on the brake. Now, here's what I want you to understand about all of this. This isn't new. Not the mechanism, not the math, not the unintended consequences. We have run this experiment before, and not that long ago. I was working when it happened. Let me show you what we learned. March 2002, I was in my early 30s working at the agency, and the Bush administration put tariffs on steel. 8 to 30%, depending on the product. The stated reason was straightforward: protect American steelworkers, bring manufacturing back, keep the mills running. I remember the announcement. It felt decisive. It felt like something was finally being done. Now I had a client at the time, a mid-sized manufacturer. They used steel in almost everything they made: equipment, components, parts. The day the tariff was announced, I called them, and the operations manager said something I've never forgotten. He said, "Our steel contracts are locked in for another 18 months, but our suppliers just raised quotes on everything else." He couldn't get out of the contracts. He couldn't pass all the costs to his customers. His prices were locked in too, so he absorbed it, quarter after quarter, for 2 years. Then, in November 2003, 21 months after the tariffs went into effect, the World Trade Organization ruled against us, found the tariffs violated America's international commitments. The European Union immediately prepared a retaliation list: $2.2 billion of American goods, carefully targeted at politically sensitive states. Florida, Michigan, Wisconsin, the kind of states you don't want angry in an election year. President Bush withdrew the tariffs in December 2003, 21 months in. Turns out the math on swing states is pretty persuasive. But here's what the math on jobs looked like. At the time, about 197,000 Americans worked in the steel-producing industry, the number of jobs lost in steel. Consuming industries, the manufacturers, the fabricators, the builders who used steel to make everything else, was estimated at over 200,000. More jobs lost in the industries the tariff didn't protect than existed in the industry it did. And when I called my client after the tariffs were lifted, the relief in his voice was real. But he also told me the customers we lost during those 2 years didn't come back. They found other suppliers. They built other relationships. That's the lesson I took away. And it wasn't tariffs are always wrong. It wasn't that simple then, and it isn't now. The lesson was, the other side always gets a vote. Every tariff is also an invitation to retaliate, to reroute, to find another supplier on another continent. And once those supply chains move, they don't always move back. Now, I've given you the mechanism. I've given you the household cost. I've given you history. But I want to do something before we close today that I think matters. I want to give you both sides of this argument, fairly, with sources, without spin, because this is a genuine debate, and you deserve to hear it whole. Now I want to take a step back, because everything I've shown you today, the toll booth, the washing machine, the steel tariffs, it would be easy to walk away thinking the case against tariffs is airtight, settled, done. It isn't. And I'd be doing you a disservice if I pretended otherwise. So let me give you both sides, fairly, with sources, starting with the case. 4. Tariffs. First, reshoring. After the 25% auto tariff went into effect, the domestic share of new vehicles sold in America rose to 54.4%. Toyota, Stellantis, Johnson & Johnson, major companies announced hundreds of billions of dollars in new American investment. The White House puts the total reshoring commitment at over $1.7 trillion. Those are real numbers, real factories, real jobs, even if, as we discussed, the employment data hasn't caught up yet. Second, national security, steel, aluminum, semiconductors. Automobiles. The argument isn't purely economic, it's strategic. The idea that America shouldn't depend on foreign supply chains for materials. Critical to its defense is a serious argument made by serious people across the political spectrum. It deserves to be heard as such. Third, revenue. Between January 2025 and January of this year, new tariffs generated somewhere between $148 and $209 billion in customs revenue. That's real money flowing into the federal budget. How you weigh that against consumer costs is a policy question. but the revenue is there. Now, the case against. We've covered most of it today, but let me put it together cleanly. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York, 90% of the tariff burden paid by Americans. Household cost, somewhere between $1,000 and $1,750 this year, depending on whose methodology you trust. Manufacturing employment, the stated goal of these tariffs, has actually fallen by roughly 59,000 jobs since April of last year. Not risen, fallen. The Yale Budget Lab estimates the long-run American economy ends up about 0.4% smaller. The Tax Foundation puts the GDP drag at closer to 0.8. And then there's retaliation. $14.9 billion in American agricultural export sales. Soybeans, beef, corn, cotton wiped out in 12 months by foreign counter tariffs. Farmers who had nothing to do with trade policy absorbed the answer to it. But the number I want to leave you with, the one that I think tells you the most about who actually carries this weight, comes from Yale's Budget Lab. They looked at the tariff burden as a share of household income across every income level, and what they found was this. The burden on the lowest income American households is more than 3 times larger as a share of their income than it is for the highest income households. Why? Because lower income families spend a bigger portion of their paycheck on goods, on clothes, on appliances, on food, the things tariffs make more expensive. They have less room to absorb a price increase, and they absorb more of it. That's not a political statement. It's arithmetic. So where does that leave us? With a genuine debate, real arguments on both sides, real costs on both sides, real uncertainty about where this lands long term. What I can tell you is what the data shows today, and what it shows today is that the bill has come due, and it didn't arrive in the mail. It came through the checkout line. Let's close on what that means for you going forward. Right. Let me pull the threads together. In our first conversation, we looked at something that's been quietly happening to American workers for years. Wages went up, but not fast enough. Not fast enough to keep pace with what things cost. The paycheck grew, but the purchasing power didn't. That was the first squeeze. In the second conversation, we looked at where that squeeze was showing up in real household behavior. Mandatory spending, the bills you can't skip, the groceries you have to buy, the gas you have to pump, was eating a bigger and bigger share of income that was already stretched thin. Savings were eroding. Debt was rising. That was the second squeeze. Today we found the third layer, a policy layer. One that doesn't announce itself. One that doesn't show up on any bill. One that works through 10,000 individual price tags across 10,000 individual products and adds up, quietly, to somewhere between $1,000 and $1,700 out of your household budget this year. That's the hidden tax. 3 squeezes. Same wallet. Now, before I let you go, I want to tell you what to watch, because this story is still moving. 2 things matter most going forward. First, whether the current tariff structure becomes permanent. The Supreme Court ruling earlier this year changed the legal foundation. The replacement framework is still finding its shape. If it holds, the household cost range we've been discussing stays in play. If it doesn't, if the structure rolls back, Yale's researchers estimate that cost drops to around $700. That's a meaningful difference, worth watching. Second, retaliation. If counter tariffs from trading partners fully materialize, agriculture, manufacturing exports, supply chains, the table we looked at today gets considerably heavier on the cost side. That's the scenario where this stops being a consumer story and becomes a job story too. Now, if today's conversation raised a question that I didn't answer, I suspect it did. Here's where it leads. We've talked about wages. We've talked about spending. We've talked about the policy layer underneath both. But there's a question sitting on top of all of this that we haven't touched yet. When prices climb this fast, when uncertainty runs this high, what do American consumers actually do? Do they pull back? Do they borrow more? And when confidence breaks, what happens to the economy that depends on them spending? That's where we're going next. And if you've made it this far, if these 3 conversations have helped you make sense of something you've been feeling in your own budget but couldn't quite name, then the rest of this series is worth your time. Everything we've built together across these videos, the wage data, the spending patterns, the policy layer. It's one connected picture. Each piece makes the next one clearer. You'll find them right here on this channel. I'll see you in the next one.